Hey guys, thanks for checking out the My Career Path podcast. I have another special guest for you today, Adrian Ropp. He is an award-winning creative director, as well as an artist. He's worked on so many different comics, movies, shows, video games like Disney Infinity and Hogwarts Legacy. So I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you're able to learn something about the creative process and getting into that field. Let's jump into it. All right, you guys, welcome back to the show, the My Career Path podcast. Today, I have a very special guest. Welcome to the show, Adrian Ropp. We're happy to have you on. Just kind of introduce yourself.
Hey, I'm Adrian Ropp, as you mentioned. I am a 30-year veteran of the entertainment industry. I've worked in film animation, TV animation, and video games and comics. I'm currently a lead writer at Avalanche Studios. They just released Hogwarts Legacy. I also was the head of story on Disney Infinity. And I've done comic books like Pink Panther, Underdog, Rocky and Bullwinkle, and Casper the Friendly Ghost.
That's awesome. I remember when we were kind of introduced and going back and forth over email, my grandma is our mutual connection. And so she was going back and forth. She's like, oh, Pink Panther, Underdog. And my wife just like perks up. She's like, I love Underdog. so she was like, I can't wait for that episode. So she's excited. And I'm sure I'm excited to talk with you too. I haven't had much experience talking with writers. And so I'd love to get into the creative process, kind of how you ended up where you did.
Sure. Well, so I have always been a huge fan of story. When I was 6 years old, my grandparents took me to see The Jungle Book. And I came out of the theater thinking that's what I want to do for a living. And I had no idea what that meant. Like I didn't understand what animators were or that they had a writer who did this story or anything like that. But I went home and I just became a ravenous artist. But I didn't just draw pictures. I drew comic strips on the inside of coloring books. They have that blank inside cover, adventures of characters, and then I'd erase it and do it again. Eventually, like I would wear out the coloring books, so my parents and grandparents started buying me, copy paper so I could save some erasers. But I've always been drawn to story. And then when I got into my first job in the industry, I apprenticed under the head of layout from the Don Bluth Studios. If you know the Don Bluth Studios, they're like An American Tail, Land Before Time, All Dogs Go to Heaven. He started his own studio. I stalked him until he hired me as an assistant. And I was planning to be an animator, but then he introduced me to something called storyboarding. And that's where you basically write and draw the movie. And then the animators actually have to draw the scenes the way that you've presented them. So that really appealed to me. And so I just kind of built my career from that. I've always just kind of been in story because of that.
That's amazing. I mean, I remember going to see my first Disney movie. We loved The Lion King growing up. That was what we played all the time, and it was our favorite one. And honestly, it's just magic. I mean, when I was that young, I didn't realize someone's drawing basically every single thing you're looking at.
Yeah, back in that day, that's what we did. Yeah,
yeah, you had to draw every frame.
Yeah, I wish I could say I watched The Lion King as a little kid, but I was older than that. So I was a grown up at that point.
Well, that's awesome. Well, let's kind of jump into your career path because you talked about some of your first jobs. What was the very first job you ever held? As a teenager, working a summer job, something like that.
Okay, so the first job I ever had was I mowed lawns. And I did it because I wanted to buy a Game Boy. And I mowed lawns until I had $125 because I wanted to buy a game with my Game Boy. And the Game Boys were $100. So I spent all summer making $125 because back in those days, they paid us in like arrowheads and rocks. So we didn't make a lot of money. But so that was my first job. And then I worked in the spud harvest. I drove spud truck when I was 15. Because in Idaho, that's a thing you can do. And then I worked at a wood pellet factory packaging wood pellets. And then I started college in St. George, Utah. So I stopped doing those jobs. And then when I was in St. George, when I wanted a little bit of extra money at the holidays, I would paint the windows on the theaters there for some money. I'd do like Disney images and things on the windows.
Oh, that's awesome. So you would already kind of start doing your artistry.
I was kind of an
people on the
entrepreneur.
windows.
Like anybody that I could convince to let me draw something for them or write something for them, like they didn't have a chance. Yeah.
That's awesome. How did you kind of get that set up? Did you just like walk in and be like, hey, can I draw, for an upcoming movie or something?
I'm a really timid person, I think. But as I look back now, 30 years later, I made some bold choices when I was younger that I didn't really have any business doing. Like with the theater thing, I just walked into the theater and said, "Hey, I'd like to talk to the manager." They went and got the manager, and he came back and I said, "Hey, I'm a cartoonist and I'd love to paint your windows for the holidays, and here's how much I'll charge." And he said, "Well, we can't pay you that much." And I said, "How about you pay me half of it in movie tickets?" And he said, "Deal." So, yeah, I've been a wheeler dealer for a long time. And then when I got my first job in the industry, this guy, his name is Mark Swan. He worked at the Bluth Studios, and then when it closed, he moved to be by his family in St. George. And they did an article about him in the newspaper there the same week that I moved down there. And so I actually wrote him a letter, and I found his address in the phone book and wrote him a letter, and I drew pictures from all of the upcoming Don Bluth movies that hadn't even been released yet because I was buying all the trade magazines and everything like that. So I drew pictures of like The Troll in Central Park and Pebble and the Penguin, all these movies that they're obscure movies now, but even back then they were like really obscure because they weren't even out. And I sent him a letter and told him what I wanted to do for a living. And he actually called me back and he's like, "How did you know what those characters like?" I think he thought that maybe I was cyber stalking him. I don't know. But
Yeah.
when he started his studio at that point, like he hired me as an assistant so I could help with things because I'd already kind of proven myself to do things, and I just kind of worked through it from there. I've made bold decisions where I've put in my time, I've done the things that I need to do, and then when I feel like I've got enough chops to do something, I'll go to people and say like, "Hey, give me a chance doing this. I think I can do it." So looking back, I think I was far more bold than I had any business being, but I still think of myself as a very timid character. When people ask me how I got into the industry, I say I basically Forrest
Yeah.
Gumped myself into a career. Like I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But I think there was a lot of moxie involved as I look back.
Especially with passions and things like that, people are a lot more confident and more willing to kind of share and be bold with something that they really love and really care about.
Yeah. Well, you have to think of it this way. I grew up in a farming community that's known worldwide for being the highest grossing potato town of the entire world. And so when I wanted to be an animator and work in the film industry, I think my poor parents were like, "Oh no, he's going to be homeless the rest of his life." But
Mm-hmm.
when you have a dream and you eat, sleep, and breathe that dream, there's nothing like it's kind of like Jiminy Cricket says, when your heart is in your dream, no request is too extreme. And that's one of my favorite phrases.
Mm-hmm.
You're willing to stick your neck out there because you believe in yourself enough that you say, "Hey, please take a chance on me." And once in a while you find people that are courageous enough to do that and giving enough to do that, take a chance on you and kind of show you the ropes. And now I'm at the point in my career that is very fulfilling because I'm in the opposite position. Now I'm meeting people that are just starting their careers and I'm trying to pass on what I know to them to give them a shot so that they can do
Yeah,
these
you're the
brilliant.
one looking back.
Exactly. And so I feel like I'm paying it forward a little bit. And then when I do that for people and they say, "Well, why are you helping me?" I say, "Because I expect you to pay it forward. 20, 30 years from now, you're going to do the same thing for somebody else. Somebody did it for me. I'm doing it for you. You'll
Yeah.
do it for somebody else." And that gives me a lot of satisfaction.
Yeah, and I think that's just something that's so important because in my position, and I feel like in a lot of other people in a similar position, just graduating from college
Mhm.
is you kind of get in this mindset of I just need to find a job just so I can get by. And you
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
people tell you, well, you kind of have to table your passions. You have to table what you really love so that you can actually make a living. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case. And clearly in your situation, it wasn't.
Well, look, even within the industry, there's some hard lessons you have to learn. I've worked like a dog for 30 years, right? And I worked a lot of overtime and
Mm-hmm.
I put in extra hours so that I can make projects good. And a while ago, I actually ended up being in kidney failure, and part of it was due to working too hard. And I was literally going to die. And so I just got a transplant, and it's made me reassess a lot of things in my life, like what's important. Even within the industry, I need to find things to do that are healthy for myself, rather than what's the biggest project I can possibly work on, what's going to be the coolest thing to tell people I worked on. I actually have to say,
Mm-hmm.
well, what about it? My art actually gives me joy. And what I've discovered is the thing that gives me joy is making the world a better place with the way I influence them with my writing and my art. And so I can make different decisions now. Even at my stage, you're like, but the mortgage payment and our insurance and all these other things, I think you get it. I don't think that feeling ever leaves you, honestly, unless you decide to make a change
Yeah.
and make something else more important. So when people say you have to set aside your dreams to find a job, I just feel like that's maybe not a great way to even think. Like you, you're not setting aside your dreams. You're look at a job you take as a step towards the job you want.
Yeah.
Uh, I'm
No, I
probably
think that's a
rambling a
great
little bit,
point.
but that's kind of how I feel.
No, I would totally agree with that, because something that I want to help inspire people is to find what they love to do and then work at it. Of course, work is still going to feel like work. There's going to be times
Yeah,
where you have to do
yeah,
things that you're not going to love. You're going to have to do some paperwork, whatever it is. But for the most part, work is such a big part of our lives, and it really should help us fulfill a purpose in some
yes.
sense. And just trying to help people figure out what that is, because I think a lot of people also just don't know what they're passionate about, don't know what they want to do, and kind of taking a risk trying to figure that out, that can be
Mhm.
scary.
I was probably in my mid 20s before it sunk into me that everybody doesn't go to a movie when they're 6 years old and gets an epiphany about what they're going to do with their life. It's pretty
Yeah.
uncommon. I got really lucky, like super super lucky. But there's something to be said for being willing to try something and fail, because it's
Hmm.
only a temporary failure, but you get this great data like, oh no, that's not what I was meant to do. And there's things I do in my career now that I wasn't expecting to do when I was 6. I absolutely love teaching, and I love directing voice work, and these are not things that I was ever considering when I was a little kid, but I learned that I loved them because I tried them out. So all of your career is just this data mining that you're doing to see what it is that you love and what you've been put here to do. I feel very strongly that I've been put here on earth for a purpose, and I'm still figuring out what that is. But
Right.
the longer you try it, the easier it gets.
I kind of want to go back to your college degree and kind of go
Yeah.
into what, St.
Yeah.
George.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of influenced you to choose to go to college?
Well, I wanted to work for Disney, and I lived in Blackfoot, Idaho, and that seemed pretty daunting. And so I wanted to go to art school because I thought that was going to be a step in the right direction so that I could, show up at the Disney store and knock on it and say, look at my artwork. You should hire me right now on the spot. And Dixie was close, and I had relatives that lived there that said I could live with them, but it was far enough, and it had a really amazing art program. And so I thought, you know what? I tried to even back then, I tried to think about 3 steps ahead of where I am in my life at that moment. Like, okay, this is an opportunity that's going to lead to this next step. I went to school because I loved drawing and I wanted to get some certification that proved to people that I knew how to draw. And, it didn't hurt that I actually had done so well in English classes in high school that I actually didn't have to take any of my English credits in college. So, yeah, so
Nice.
this kind of worked out. And I have to tell you, I don't recommend this career path to pretty much anybody. But I started working for Mark Swan while I was in college still, and he had people from Disney and Don Bluth Studios and Warner Brothers coming to work freelance on his film that he was making. And they would sit there at their animation desks and teach me everything they knew. And I realized at that point I was learning way more from them than I was at school. So I actually didn't get a degree. I actually stopped going to school because I couldn't do both things. And I was getting an
Yeah.
education. It just wasn't something I was paying for anymore. And again, that's like not this is an edge case scenario, and I do not encourage people to not go to college. But because I had that opportunity to learn all of these amazing things from these amazing, talented people, I felt like I was getting the on the job experience that would, art and writing are kind of trades. And so I felt like the work I was doing was more like a trade school.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's another critical part of deciding on a career path and finding mentors, finding people that you
Yeah.
can really glean from and learn from. Let's kind of jump into that. Who are some of the
Okay.
mentors that you've had in your life that have just inspired you to continue on this path?
I said earlier that I felt like I Forrest Gumped myself into a career.
Yeah.
This is going to prove it out. So Mark Swan was the head of layout, and that's the department that makes all the background planning and everything for the films. For American Tail, Land Before Time, All Dogs Go to Heaven, Rockadoodle, Thumbelina, Troll in Central Park, and Pebble and the Penguin. And he also worked in TV stuff for a bunch of years before that. And then he wanted to make his own studio. So that was my first boss. And then he hired a special effects animator named Bob Simmons, who had done these award-winning effects for movies like Cats Don't Dance and Iron Giant and Swan Princess. And then we also had Jared Beckstrand, who is a character animator at Disney, who animated Esmeralda, Pacha in Emperor's New Groove,
Yeah.
Jane in Tarzan. I think he actually even did a little bit of work on that new Mary Poppins movie. But these are all people that came to their studio and were willing to teach me stuff. We had Marcella Vignali, who was a concept artist that worked at Disneyland and actually designed the Roger Rabbit ride at Disneyland. He actually lived in the St. George area, so we'd have workshops with him. There was a cool guy that made a master violin maker, and we'd have workshops with him just to get our minds around how to have artistry in our craft. And then one of my dearest collaborators and mentors ever, his name was Rick Estrada, and he used to do comic book work for DC Comics. And then he worked at Hanna-Barbera on things like Wacky Races and Smurfs. And then he worked on He-Man, and he did a lot of stuff. He had a long and storied career. He could actually draw comic pages ambidextrously. So he could draw
What?
with his right hand and ink with his left hand, or I might have that backwards. So because,
That's crazy.
well, at one point he was the sole provider for his family, and that's how he was making a living. So he learned how to do it. So he could do, his page rate was what they lived and died by. So he
Wow.
learned how to do that so that he could do more pages. He drew the Spider-Man newspaper comic for a while, and he worked on Wonder Woman and Sergeant Rock, which is a war comic. And he was so gracious with his time. I just go into his office and say, like, Rick, I'm really struggling with this scene. I don't know how to lay it out correctly or what to do to sort of manipulate the audience into the way I want them to feel. And he would sit there and he'd sketch out the answer for me and explain to me why he was sketching that answer out. And he's unfortunately passed away now, but he was one of my dearest friends and collaborators, and I learned so much from him. It was insane. So I got these like masters of the craft that were just giving me this free advice all the time, and so you can understand why I stopped going to school.
Oh,
It- it-
absolutely. I mean, it's one thing to learn
well,
from books. It's another thing to be in the room with someone with so much
yeah.
experience, so much talent, and to just kind of soak that all in. I'm sure that was amazing.
Now, one thing I will give myself credit for is that there's a lot of guys who would have maybe been starstruck and not been willing to listen to that advice or ask for advice, and they just would have just stood by and not. There's people that would not have taken advantage of that situation.
Hmm.
And I think one of the reasons that I have a career now is because I did. I took advantage of that, not in a smarmy way, but like, they offered and I accepted. Like it's such a gracious gift for them to give me. And I had a lot of gratitude about it. So I think a lot of times I've seen young people get so obsessed with what they're doing that they don't want to hear criticisms or advice from people that have been in the industry longer because they think that means that they're not good, and
Yeah.
so they don't take advantage of things like that. But there's opportunities all the time. I went to Salt Lake Comic Con a few years ago, and I'm a huge Archie Comics fan, and there's a guy there named Bill Galvin, and he had a booth, and I just went up and started talking to him and told him who I was, gave him my bona fides, and we ended up collaborating. He actually stuck his neck out for me at Archie Comics, like, hey, can my friend Adrian write some stories for me to draw? And that
Hmm.
worked out really nicely too. But I went up to creators. I was kind and respectful to them. I told them why I know who they are and what they've done that I am interested in, and how they've influenced my life. And then when I had established a friendship, then I would ask questions. A lot of guys will just go up and say, like, hey, can I just ask you a whole bunch of questions? like I developed friendships first. I think I was actually better at networking than I probably gave myself credit for. But it helped me a lot because all these people were so gracious with their time because I was respectful of theirs.
Well, and I think that's a really key point, especially when you're working with such, I would say, famous people. Is I think a lot of people would get in that position of I don't know what to say. I'm just so taken aback, and
Yeah.
I think, and I'm not a famous person by any means, but I would imagine that they would kind of be like, okay, well, I'm also just a normal person, like
Yeah.
I have my same struggles. I've worked my way up, but I don't know. Do they get tired of kind of hearing that, and that's where sticking out and just saying, hey, I really want to learn. I'm eager to talk with you and kind of be a normal person around you. Is that what they're kind of looking for?
Yeah, yeah. Everybody loves when somebody loves their work. Like
Hmm.
as an artist, that's like serotonin. So it's really nice, but there comes a point where you're like, okay, I get it. You like what I did, and can we be real now? And that's the point where you have to get to, is start just being treating them like a real human being.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard. Like I've done a lot of voice directing in my career because the writers often voice direct. And I remember getting to the point where I felt like I was jaded because I recorded Samuel L. Jackson as Nick Fury, and it was just a normal session. And, I got done, and everybody in the studio was like, "Well, how did it go? How did it go?" I said, "It went fine. You did a good job," and that was it. Like I turned off that starstruck part of my head, but I know that like 20-year-old Adrian would have just been like sobbing, crying because he was so amazed at that opportunity. So you get to that point where you realize, oh, these are just
Yeah.
normal
Yeah.
people. Like they have wants and dreams too, and they want to make a difference in the world. So you just treat them differently.
Well, I want to kind of get into what you're currently working on, as
Okay.
far as what your normal day to day life works or job kind of looks like. So, like a day like today, or maybe this last week, what was your kind of normal job look like?
So I'm gonna like adjust that question a little bit because I'm actually still on
Sure.
leave from my kidney transplant. So I'll tell you when
Okay.
I'm working what
Okay.
my normal day looks like because that's probably what you want to hear. You don't want to hear me say
Yeah,
like,
sounds great.
"Oh, I
Yeah.
get
Well,
blood work
when you're just
done."
doing a normal working day, yeah, what does
Yeah.
that look like for you?
So as head of story, I'd go and I'd arrive at work. There's a flood of emails of things that needed to get done. We have a tasking program, and I'd go in and usually have to divvy out work to the writing staff. A couple of times a week we'd have a meeting where we'd all check in with each other and figure out what strategy we need to do. And then usually the design team had a bunch of questions or requests that I needed to fulfill, so I deal with that for the first part of the day. And then I found that as somebody who needed to have my finger on the pulse, the first thing I did in the afternoon after lunch was I would actually just walk around the studio, because a lot of times people needed something from you or they had an idea that was really good, but they were busy and they kept forgetting to talk to you about it. And so I would actually just walk around the studio, just seeing if anybody noticed me and said, "Oh, wait, I wanted to talk to you about something." And it worked so well. It was crazy. Everybody would stop me and say, "Oh, hey, I had a question for you." And so I did that the first part of the afternoon, and then the second part of the afternoon there was like reviewing writing and scheduling voice work and things like that. So my job took a lot more administrative role to it. As a lead writer, I would just go in and talk to the design team. They'd have ideas for what they wanted to do for the gameplay, and then I would write a story wrapper that would support that. Then we'd go over it together and we'd get it signed off by the franchise and by the company and the producers and everything like that. Make sure it was within our budget and scope and everything like that. So there's a lot of collaborative work there. I think that's the big thing that people should understand with writing it for like a corporation. If you're writing a novel, you're pretty much working alone most of the time until you get to an editor and a publisher. But
Hmm.
if you're writing for a video game, it's a very collaborative process. Everybody's in everybody else's business, and by the time the final product's done, nobody can remember if they wrote a line or if somebody else wrote a line, because you've all collaborated so much on everything.
Well, that's good to know. So it's a much more cooperative, collaborative thing. How do
Yes.
you how do you balance out working with so many different people?
If you're lucky, you find really good, talented people that don't have egos. because as soon as you introduce an ego into the situation, it ruins it. Nobody feels like they can be trusted by expressing their ideas. They're worried about the drama that it might cause. They're worried about who gets credit for what thing. So you try to hire people that you can sense don't have that ego problem. Have I been 100% successful at that? Absolutely not. But
Hmm.
when it works, it's about the most rewarding experience you can have. It's just like a bunch of wheels on a cog all working in unison together. So it can be really fun. But I think I worked at Pixar a lot, and they have a brain trust, and they come in and they screen every new film like every 2 to 3 months. And at the very beginning, those films are all the worst films you've ever seen in your life. They're just storyboards to video, but they're really bad. And so what they do is they actually give people, they trust their writers, they trust their story people. And so they give them a chance to try brave things. And sometimes they don't work. And everybody admits, oh, that didn't work at all. And they move on. And the only way that those films ever get to this great level that they usually get to is this iterative process where they just try brave things and they trust each other. Nobody gets a demerit if they make a bad decision for a story. They just go, well, no, that didn't work. Let's try this instead. And they move on. Nobody has to obsess about a mistake they made. It's not a mistake. It's just a journey.
Especially in some of the more creative fields. I did an interview with, she works in an architectural firm,
Okay.
and she kind of said a similar thing where, when you're doing these kind of creative processes, you can take offense to certain things, or you can say, you know what, maybe that's not the best idea. Let's move forward with something else. And
Yeah.
just making sure that you can get on the same page with other people to go forward and not being afraid to fail.
Yeah.
Trying new things, trying things out, I think is a increasingly more critical, and things that people kind of shy away from, and they choose to go a little bit more safe path, a little bit more reserved.
Exactly. Sometimes if you're working in a huge group of people as a creative person, you have to be a politician. How do I,
Hmm.
sometimes I find myself thinking, how do I get my idea to be the thing that people want to do by convincing them that it was their idea? And
Hmm.
yeah, so I do that a lot. But you have to be a really good politician in order to be collaborative in a group of creative people, because everybody has strong ideas. Everybody. The janitor has
Yeah.
strong ideas about what you should do with the story. So, and the truth of the matter is, the janitor might have the best idea of everybody, and you should be willing to recognize that. So that's where
Yeah,
the not having an ego comes in.
that's a great point. And I think that's something else that I really appreciate in just talking with people about their careers. There's so many different backgrounds. And even though someone may be at a company for, 30, 40 years, doesn't mean that everything they say is going to be gold.
Yeah,
It's going to take some work. It takes some refining, some polish to make things what they are and
yeah,
what people get to experience. Just jumping in here real quick to share a website I've used and will continue to use to improve myself in my career. Skillshare is an online learning community with over 20,000 classes to choose from. Whatever you're passionate about, you can find an amazing class on Skillshare to hone your practice. Skillshare has what you need. Learning is so critical for our lives and is a lifelong journey. Even when we finish school, we should keep on learning and keep working to improve ourselves. So you can try Skillshare absolutely free for 1 month. Go to Skillshare.com and sign up and use the code MyCareerPathFree. That's all lowercase, no spaces, to start your first month at no charge. And when you do decide to keep on taking those classes, use the code MyCareerPath30, that's MyCareerPath30, to get 30% off your first year on Skillshare. Keep learning and keep going. And now let's get back to the show. What would you say is probably the most rewarding part about your job and your career?
So I was the head of story on the Disney Infinity video game phenomenon. That's the game that had the toys that would come to life when
Yeah,
you
you
put them
had
on
the little miniatures that you could put on and they'd
Yeah,
come on your
yeah.
screen.
And everybody loves those miniatures because they're so beautifully made. But
Yeah.
that game came out 10 years ago. In fact, we just celebrated the 10th anniversary of it a couple of weeks ago. Came out 10 years ago. They haven't made the game for 7 years.
Hmm.
And when I was in Denver last month, I had a kid come up to my booth and slam down the packaging from the first Infinity game on my table. And he had this huge grin on his face and he asked me to sign it. And I said, well, I'm not going to sign it. I'm going to give you a big hug because I can't believe you still have this. So I went around to the table and he was with his sister, and his sister said he's played this game every day for 10 years. It's his favorite game. He loves it so much. And I
Wow.
reached out to, take a picture with him, and he just lunged into my arms and gave me the hugest hug. And I started crying, and I'm going to cry now thinking about it. But if you've ever worked on something that had that kind of effect on people, you want it bad. Like you just crave that to happen again. I worked on something that meant so much to somebody that they made it a part of their life, and they he bought a ticket to Denver Comic Con so he could meet me, of all things. Like, I'm just me. I'm nobody's special, but I did this wonderful thing that made his life so much better. I love that that game is a game that parents play with their kids all the time, and it draws families together. There's kids that are nonverbal autistic kids that have learned how to be verbal through the characters of Disney Infinity. I don't know how anybody can go back to being having a normal life, being a civilian after they've had something like that happen. I crave that every day of my life. What can I do now that's going to affect people in the same way that that affected people?
That's amazing. Honestly, I can't imagine what that would feel like. Just
It's
to see
it's like a
something like
drug.
that have such, yeah. And I've heard comedians talk about it kind of behind the scenes where it's a similar experience where if you tell a joke that the crowd just loves, and it's like a wave that just hits you,
Yeah.
you just feel that it's something that's like, hey, that's going to stick with people.
Yes.
And having that effect on people, I'm sure that's amazing. And trying to replicate that over and over again
Yeah.
can sometimes, I'm sure, be a little disheartening, but when you hit it, I mean, I bet that's just a rush.
It's amazing. I all these mentors that I've had, they all sort of sadly faded into obscurity a bit when everything changed to computer generated animation,
Mhm.
and they've struggled throughout the years. I've gotten a couple of them to start doing comic book conventions, and I said, people love your work. You need to meet your fans. It will make you feel so much better. And they'll say, oh, nobody cares about All Dogs Go to Heaven. That was a critically panned movie. And I said, I promise you, some kid out there, that's their favorite movie ever. And they come to these conventions and people just cry because it reminds them of their childhood. And I'm old enough now that it's happening to me where people are saying, thank you for my childhood. And I'm like, I'm not old enough for you to thank me for that, but I am. Uh, but I wanted them to see, like, they deserved to get that recognition that they've sort of been in obscurity for a long time. But there's all these people whose lives have been affected for the better because of what they worked on, and it's just the most beautiful thing to watch. So yeah, I not only crave that emotion, but I'm making other people get addicted to it as well.
A couple more questions for you. What are some of
Sure.
the traits that kind of stand out in the people that you work with? What really stands out to you as something that you look for in the people you work with, as well as maybe potential hires, someone you might look to
Yeah,
start working with?
yeah, they're kind of similar questions. I When I'm hiring somebody, I would rather hire somebody who has marginal talent and a good attitude than somebody
Mm-hmm.
that has amazing talent and a bad attitude. You can't work with somebody with a bad attitude. They won't listen to any direction. It'll just be a fight every day of your life. And so, good attitude, no ego, that is the number one most important quality of any job. I really
Mm-hmm.
believe that. And then, second, I look for people who are very analytical, because somebody can say, like, oh, I want to write this scene because it will be cool. I don't want that. I want somebody who will come in and say, I want to do this scene because the character arc, the main character has been striving to do this for all this time, and this is the perfect visualization of him trying to reach for that idea and missing. And like,
Mm-hmm.
when somebody can analyze a scene that they've written in that way, the audience is going to subconsciously get that as well. And so you're going to get a lot better writing. So those are the two qualities that I most look for.
Is there anything that you wish you would have done differently on your career path to maybe get where you are sooner, or maybe just have a little bit different experience?
I am one of the luckiest human beings that's ever lived on this planet. And as part of that, I don't regret anything. Everything that has happened in my life has given me the experience that got me to be the Adrian that I am right now. And so I know that's kind of a cheap answer, but I don't look back. I don't wish I'd done anything differently because I love who I am and I love where I am in my career.
Well, that's awesome, and I think that's a great way to live. Um, Not that you don't have any regrets or anything like that, but just understanding, those experiences and what I've done kind of have
Yeah.
made me who I am, and I like who I am.
5 years ago, I actually slipped on the ice and I shattered my drawing arm and it destroyed all the nerves in my drawing arm. And they told me I'd never draw again. And I had a pretty bad crisis of faith back then because my art was my love language. That's how I spoke to the world. And then I couldn't do it at all. I literally taped a pencil to my hand because I couldn't hold it to see if I could draw. And I couldn't. I started trying to learn how to draw with my left hand. Through a lot of therapy and 8 months of extreme patience, I actually got enough of my drawing ability back that I could actually continue my career. But I look at the work I do now and how much more soulful it is, and how much more empathetic it is, and how much more I understand the trials of my characters and really putting myself in their shoes. And I wouldn't have got to that spot if I hadn't gone through the arm break. So, as a writer, I think it's really important for you to look internally and figure out what it is that you want to say to the world. And I feel like I've gone through a fire to get to where I am, but everything that I've gone through, good or bad, has given me a better writing career. So I just appreciate it so much.
What would be your advice to someone looking to be a writer or a lead story director and a creative director?
So don't try to start by getting a lead creative director job. Work your way up. I've literally had people come to me and say like, "Yeah, I see you've got this entry level story job, but what I really want to do is direct." I don't hire
Uh-huh.
those people, but because that's the ego thing again. You know what? Learn your craft. Write as much as you can. Study story deeply. Study methodology. Do really well in English. Absorb books. Absorb movies. Look for opportunities to express your craft. Ask the local newspaper, hey, can I write articles for you? And maybe it's unpaid, but that's good practice for you. And you can put that you've got a publication on your resume. There's two books that I also recommend that are Save the Cat, which is basically a screenwriting book that kind of tells you through the way to do a plot,
Hmm.
and The Writer's Journey, which actually dissects 80s movies and tells you why they're appealing to people. And it does it in this way that's really palatable and understandable to the layperson. So those are the two books I always recommend. Also, I'm
That's
teaching a
awesome.
class on writing for games, so I'm doing a lot of work there. But I think if you just look for writing gigs, big or small, they all snowball into bigger opportunities.
Start building up experience, kind of stretching your writing muscle and getting that going.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, you're going to find people publish trade magazines that are looking for writers for articles all the time. And like I said, a lot of times they're unpaid, but when you're early on in your career and you think you've got the chops to do something special with that, maybe consider it,
Yeah.
because then you can put it on your resume. People might take notice of it. I do, I would say, a consistent amount of freelance work, and I've never actually looked for it.
Hmm.
I just post very frequently on my social media, and that just draws the people to me because I'm proving what I can do, and they say, "Oh, we'd like to do that with you." So there's something to be said about being engaging, sharing your work as much as you can.
That's awesome. Well, Adrian, I really appreciate you taking the time to share your story, share some advice and things that you've had. One last thing before I let you go, I love asking people about funny stories that they've had over their career paths. Do you have any story that you'd be willing to share with everybody?
Funny stories. Okay, so this isn't funny as much as it is just sweet,
Hmm.
but it's probably the best you're going to get out of me because
Sounds great. I'm excited.
it's my heart. Um, the voices of Mickey and Minnie Mouse were husband and wife in real life, and his name was Wayne Allwine, and he would always show up late to the recording sessions, and his wife Lucy Taylor was always there on time. And so
Uh-huh.
when Wayne would walk into the studio, she would always look over him at him, beam, and say, "Oh, there's my handsome prince." And so Wayne passed away suddenly, and he had diabetes really bad, and that left Rusi alone. And they, we about that time is when we actually decided to add Minnie Mouse to Disney Infinity, and I got to write and direct that script. And so there's lines that Minnie can say to Mickey when she sees him in the game, and say like, "Oh, hi, Mickey," or "Nice day we're having," and things like that. But I got approval to have her say, "Oh, there's my handsome prince," just as a little love letter for her in our game. And it's still, Rusi is one of my dearest friends. She's also passed away now, but I will forever just love that I got to put that in our game, her little love letter to her husband. So that's not, nobody's going to roll me out of laughing at that story, but it's a bit of trivia.
Oh, that's going to, everyone's going to smile at that. I mean, how could you not?
I'm impressed that you're such a good interviewer. That's the first time I've told that story without crying my eyes out.
So there you have it, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Adrian. I know I really loved learning from him about the creative process, writing, just making sure you're working that writing muscle and getting to know the right people, I think was just really important for him. And I think it's something that can really help you in your career. If you like this episode, make sure to leave a 5-star review. Reach out to me on my website, mycareerpathpodcast.com. Catch you guys later.